Well, hello everyone, wherever you may be. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Michael Kugelman. I'm the director of the Wilson Center's South Asia Institute. For 5 years now, the Wilson Center, in partnership with South Asia Democracy Watch, has been hosting an annual lecture series in honor of the late Asma Jahangir, a leading human rights activist from Pakistan who passed away in 2018. The lecture series features an annual address by a distinguished scholar, opinion leader, or activist who addresses issues of democracy and human rights in South Asia. Our past lecturers have been Dr. Aisha Jalal, Dr. Aisha Siddiqa, Dr. Anita Weiss, and last year, Dr. Sandeep Pandey. We are delighted to be hosting today this year's lecturer, Dr. Shahidul Alam, a photojournalist and activist from Bangladesh. He will be discussing his work, past and present, and he will share his observations about the state of rights and democracy in Bangladesh today. We will hear more about and from Dr. Alam in just a few moments, but let me first briefly set the stage a bit. In recent years, we have seen stepped up crackdowns by the ruling Awami League Party in Bangladesh on the opposition and on dissent more broadly in Bangladesh. These crackdowns have taken the form of relatively new tools, such as online surveillance and a digital security law to suppress online criticism of the government, as well as older tactics like the use of force to curb peaceful protest. There are also concerns expressed most recently by experts appointed by the UN Human Rights Council about enforced disappearances and extrajudicial killings. This is not a new story in Bangladesh. In previous years, when the opposition Bangladesh Nationalist Party was in power, and certainly when the country was under military rule in previous years, there were serious threats to rights and democracy. Shahidul Alam has been there for more than 40 years, documenting so much of this. He's seen a lot, and he's had to suffer for it as well, as in 2018 when he spent several months in jail after he criticized Dhaka's brutal response to protests over road safety. He has founded libraries, media institutes, and photography festivals. He's a visiting professor. He's the publisher of several books. He is a public intellectual with a public conscience. Before we turn things over to him, I'd like to introduce my friend and collaborator, Kaiser Abbas, Executive Director of South Asia Democracy Watch, our partner in this lecture series. He will offer some brief thoughts and introduce Dr. Alam. Kaiser is a scholar, journalist, and development consultant. He is currently advisor to the Human Rights Program at Southern Methodist University. His publications include the book From Terrorism to Television, Dynamics of Media, State, and Society in Pakistan. And I should say that South Asia Democracy Watch, where he's executive director, is a nonprofit group that promotes social justice, human rights, and equality in South Asia through educational programs, conferences, and symposia. After Kaiser introduces Dr. Alam, we will hear Dr. Alam's lecture, and then myself, Kaiser, and another member of South Asia Democracy Watch, Aftab Siddiqui, a human rights activist in Texas, will be on hand to ask a few questions to Dr. Alam before we open up to questions from the audience. And if you'd like to ask a question and you're in the audience, at any time during the event, you should see a Q&A feature on this webcast. At the bottom of your screen, you can type in your question and then submit it to us. So with that, I will turn things over to you, Kaiser.
Well, thank you, Michael, for the wonderful introduction of the Asma Jahangir Lecture series. We have been doing it for the last 4 years, and this is the fifth year. Thanks for your collaboration. Uh, we are fortunate to have a known human rights activist, photojournalist, and a scholar from Bangladesh today. He will speak on human rights in his country, Bangladesh. Uh, he has combined activism with photojournalism as he continues to challenge human rights abuses through his photographic work. But also, with a doctorate in chemistry, he's currently visiting professor at University of Sunderland in the UK. He also founded several organizations, including Drick Picture Library, South Asian Media Institute, and the Chobi Mela International Photography Festival. And also he has received several international awards. Recently he received International Press Freedom Award from the Committee to Protect Journalism. With that introduction, back to you, Michael, for his introduction. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kaiser. In fact, I'm going to now turn things over to our featured lecturer, Dr. Alam. The floor is yours.
Oh, thank you, Michael. Thank you, Kaiser, for that kind introduction. I'm delighted to be on a platform that supports independent research and open dialogue. Thank you for having me. That is precisely the recipe that could address many of the wrongs I'll be discussing today. I wish I could have seen you as you're seeing me, but I'll start with a photo at the Asma Jahangir conference in Lahore in October 2019. Let me try sharing the screen and see if things work. This is, as I said, it's a picture I took when I was at the Asma Jahangir conference in Lahore in October 2019. This is Ali Ahmed Kurd, the former president of the Supreme Court Bar Association of Pakistan. Ali Ahmed was a rebel lawyer, but pretty much everyone else was there too. People from opposing political camps, from all walks of life, the upper class and the subaltern, all genders, lots of youngsters, different religions. It was remarkable. I'd never met Asma, but was floored by how she'd been able to cross all divides, and how such a diverse group of people had assembled around her because of their belief in justice. This, in a sense, is what we hope to achieve in South Asia. Not everything worked out at the conference. I remember that Stephen Butler of the Committee to Protect Journalists had been given a visa, but had been turned away at the airport. There was something else that struck me during that visit to Lahore. I didn't have to dodge posters of politicians along the way to the venue. The only image I saw was once I came close. It was Fatima Jinnah. She was unlikely to be competing in any upcoming elections. It was very different from the visual fatigue we get in Bangladesh, where politicians of all shapes and sizes leer at you wherever you look, from billboards, hoardings, dangling from footbridges, plastered onto walls. There's no respite. That brings me to my talk today. It is about today's Bangladesh. I'll be talking of the removal of the last military regime, which led to the first relatively free election. I'll also talk about how democracy has fared since then. So let's see if the pictures work. This photo was taken on the 10th of November, 1987, Dhaka Siege Day. We still use old colonial laws that were meant to suppress the natives, and Section 144 was in place to prevent more than 4 people gathering. This is Motijheel, the heart of the commercial district, the Champs-Élysées of Dhaka. It was a winter morning and people gathered despite Section 144. The police came and dispersed them. They regrouped. We were trying to bring down yet another military general. A young worker, Nur Hussain, had painted on his back, "Let democracy be free." And he stood roughly where I was standing when I took this picture. He was killed by police bullets. Let me go to the next picture. Nur Hussain has since become a symbol of our struggle for democracy. Young men paint "Let democracy be freed" on their bare backs. Dhrik has Nur Hussain tote bags. This was a mural on Jahangirnagar University campus. An interesting thing is visible here. All the leading political parties coexist on these walls. This would be unheard of today. The halls have become the private property of the ruling party. Their students control the dorms. They get the government tenders. Party faithfuls get tenure in the faculty. And unbelievably, there is evidence of torture cells in public universities. Resistance was building against the general. He did pretty much what every regime has done since. Secularism had been a key pillar of our constitution. On 9th of June 1988, the Parliament of Bangladesh passed the 8th Constitutional Amendment. Article 2A was inserted to declare Islam as a state religion. With its 10th strength tottering, President Shah tried to win support among right-wing voters. Now, the genie is out of the bottle. We were able to bring down the general. The people had won, or so it seemed. This picture was taken in January 1996. As the first genuinely elected party was facing elections at the end of its term, the democratically elected new government was also repressive. State media was completely converted to a propaganda tool for the government, leading me to write an open letter to the Prime Minister regarding the suppression of free speech. She didn't respond, but at least it didn't land me in jail. Prior to the elections, the police rounded up students seen to be opposition-leaning. That was a time when pro-opposition students could stay in student dorms. These are students in Jagannath Hall, perceived to be pro-Awami League. The dorms were ransacked by the police and the students dragged away in prison vans. I didn't know when I was taking this photo that I too would be put into a similar van by the very party whose rights I was then defending. My earlier work, A Struggle for Democracy, had been censored. The newly elected government tried to rig the next election and use the military to pick up and torture opposition activists prior to the elections. The NGOs were up in arms, but felt they couldn't take the risk of challenging it themselves. But they did come to a protest organized by three. The following morning, I was attacked in the streets and received 8 knife wounds. But the resistance worked, and the government was forced to arrange another election under a neutral caretaker government, which it promptly lost. This perhaps is the time to talk about our elections. Bangladesh has had 11 elections. 7 have been under incumbent governments, 4 under neutral caretaker governments. All 7 under incumbent have been won by the incumbent. All 4 under caretaker have gone to the opposition. So the figures are pretty clear. If it's an incumbent government holding the elections, the government will stay. If it's a caretaker government, then the government will go. It's a 100% match. Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina herself had said she would support the caretaker government principle for life. But once she saw incumbent means you win and caretaker means you lose, and since she had sufficient majority, she decided to change the rules of the game and abolish the caretaker system. So based on the earlier statistic, being the incumbent, Hasina would remain for life, which is presumably her plan. Under the caretaker government, Jatiya Party, the incumbent government lost. Then again, under the caretaker government, BNP lost. And then Awami League lost. Then BNP lost again. So the pattern was clear. Under a neutral caretaker government, the incumbent lose. Oh, I've done this. I'll just skip it. The last time BNP were in power, they introduced the Rapid Action Battalion, RAB as we call it. As with all autocratic regimes, the stripping of people's rights are justified by the need to curb corruption. RAB became a Frankenstein, and Awami League, at the receiving end of RAB actions, protested loudly and promised to abolish RAB if elected. Soon after being elected, the foreign minister declared at the UN in Geneva zero tolerance to extrajudicial killings. Crossfire deaths continued unabated, later to be accompanied by disappearances. In 2009, when Zrik had a show on Tibetans in exile, the Chinese government exerted pressure on the Bangladesh government to close down the show. When we put up the show Crossfire in 2010, and that's what I'm alluding to in this picture of the paddy field. I don't have time to explain the whole story here, but the pictures were taken of what we assume to be what the dying person might have seen in the last moments of their life. Well, when we put up the show Crossfire, we were prepared. When armed police surrounded our gallery and locked up our office, we took the opening to the streets. We protested on the streets. We made mobile versions of the exhibit, which people could hang photos from, trees, put them up in marketplaces and football fields. The erosion of civil liberties didn't happen overnight. Those were the days the courts could still rule against the government, and we were able to open the show for a day. The independence of the judiciary is now history. We also spoke out for the rights of garment workers. A New York Times report of 2019 stated that of the 300 Bangladeshi members of parliament, an estimated 60% were involved in the garment industry. So we set up a billboard in front of the illegally built Garment Owners Association building. The photo was of the carcass of a garment factory which had been gutted by fire. The owners had locked the gate, preventing the workers from escaping, and many died. Now, you might, from what I've said so far, assume that my government does not really take the arts or journalism seriously, or that we are ignored. I want to dispel that myth. How many of you guys have had this sort of a response to your exhibition? Since they'd gotten rid of the caretaker form of government, they no longer needed the people's vote, and public vote no longer matters. So major public protests have been undertaken without consultation with the public in any form, and protesters fare tear gas and bullets. This is me at one of those rallies. It was about a suppression of protests against a coal power plant being set up close to the mangrove forests in the Sundarbans. Disappearances were also an issue. The Chittagong Hill Tracts are effectively under military occupation, and Kalpana Chakma, a leader of the Hill Women's Federation, was picked up by the military on 12th of June 1996 and has never been found since. So we developed a special technique to etch images of those we were still campaigning for. They were etched on the very maps that the Paharis slept on. I want to now go on to the last 5 years. Conflict of interest is nothing new to Bangladesh, and not something that has ever concerned our lawmakers. We earlier talked of owners of garment industries. Let's look at the transport sector. Shahjahan Khan was both a minister and executive president of the Bangladesh Road Transport Workers Federation on 29th of July 2018. And when Dia Khanam Mim and Abdul Karim Rajib of Shahid Ramizuddin Cantonment College were run over by a bus, they were standing on the footpath outside their college. The transport workers are a powerful group, and speeding buses causing accidents were common. Having a powerful minister as a president provided a degree of impunity to transport workers, and the governments had failed to curb road accidents. Students took to managing the streets. They found numerous vehicles with fitness certificates, without fitness certificates, and many drivers without licenses. This included police vehicles and those of ministers. Ruling party hoods, supported by the police, attacked unarmed students. On 4th of August, I too got attacked while reporting on the story. I was in the streets again on 5th of August and gave an interview on Al Jazeera. That night, from exactly where I'm sitting now, in our flat, I was picked up by security forces, tortured, and after a week in remand, spent another 100 days in jail before being released on bail. I'm on bail now. The law under which I was charged was repealed in October 2018. But 5 years after the incident, the trial has not yet begun. The charge sheet has not been framed, yet I still need to appear in court every month. I was there on the 17th of July, I think, and I'm again appearing on the 23rd of August. Just to give you a comparison, Zafar Ahmed Joseph, one of the top criminals in the police list of the 1990s, and under life sentence for murder, was freed from jail after a presidential clemency. Joseph's brother just happened to be the chief of staff. But I'd like to come back to the acts of ordinary people. This is a very well-known photograph of mine, which has been published all over the globe and also been used illegally by the ruling party for its propaganda. Their mascot is the boat. While I was in hospital and jail, fellow prisoners asked me for this photo, and I was able to get in one of the books. When I came out of hospital, I saw on the outer wall of the hospital this 12-foot mural they'd made in my honor. I'd been actively involved in prison reform, and we'd been able to set up, with fellow prisoners, a musical band, bring in books to the library, start adult literacy classes, and a vegetable patch. Interestingly, since I came out, the government has since produced a promotional video, using the reforms we had begun as a way to show how wonderful their jails were. So they don't only just deny what they do, they take credit for what they don't do. So let me go on to that.
That is why Kernigham's prison has been working very hard to provide the right kind of environment that can influence positive mentality, enhance abilities, and broaden perspectives, so that the inmates don't need to be forced, rather they want to participate spontaneously. Everyone's newly realized goodness, with proper directives, is inspiring others to do the right things. Spreading the splendor of their minds, they're leaving their beautiful mark in every wall, garden, pathways, every corner, to make the environment more and more pleasing.
There we are.
That it can never be found in destruction.
All of this is part of a propaganda film that the government had done to show what
many are distressed for the scarcity of fuel for the mind. Access to arts, literature, music, science, culture, that means practice of the mind, can elevate people from the depth of darkness towards enlightenment and correction.
And it's pure propaganda.
রাখিব নিরাপদ, দেখাবো আলোর পথ।
Oops, I'm missing a picture, but I'll come to that. Let's see if I've gone too far. I am missing a picture, but we'll ignore that. In 1998, Joshimuddin Manik, General Secretary of Jahangirnagar University Army League, celebrated his 100th rape on campus. Many of the leading intellectuals of the country across party lines have then joined the student protests. Rape and other acts of injustice, mostly with the ruling party involved, has increased manyfold. But today, most of these intellectuals are largely silent. The picture you're seeing is by a group that's called Feminists Across Generations. I'm now out on bail, but I still potentially face 14 years in prison if I'm convicted. But there are many who, despite the repression, still continue to resist. This is a group of women who call themselves Feminists Across Generations, who are protesting against a particularly violent rape. And I mentioned the earlier incidents of the 100th rape being celebrated. This is in front of the House of Parliament, a bit ironic for me, a grand building for a country that has not had a proper election in 15 years. It is a grand building, designed by Louis Kahn. And the next picture is, these are artists protesting against the draconian Digital Security Act. which has largely been used to arrest journalists who have dared to report on government crimes and injustice. A free and fair election requires a level playing field. On the 18th and 19th of July, during BNP's recent events, police lodged 10,438 cases against unidentified people in 8 districts. Millions of young people have come of voting age since 2008 who have never had a chance to vote. It's said that some 4 million BNP activists have had cases against them. The education system's been ruined. Citizens, as well as mainstream media, practice self-censorship. Merit no longer matters. The only qualification for success is unquestionable party loyalty. Islam Shorkar, a young BNP leader of Bongshal, Old Dhaka, has 313 cases against him. As I mentioned before, since 2012, there have been some 4 million cases against BNP people. What space is there for opposition? The seeking of justice has been criminalized. A 17-year-old student with kidney problems who was jailed for having anchored a TV program which the government didn't like has been there for 11 months. Respected citizens who have questioned the court's failure to give bail had been charged with contempt of court. Critical thinking is illegal. The Digital Security Act is barbaric and is throttling the media, but they're turning to other options too. Rosina Islam, a journalist, was charged under an outdated 1923 colonial law, which infringes on civil society's fundamental rights of access to information. There's a witch hunt against the most prominent citizen of the country. I think you know who I'm referring to. It's Professor Yunus. The leader of the opposition is under arrest. The Chief Justice has been sent in exile. Citizens have not had a chance to meaningfully vote in 15 years. Academics are legally prohibited from doing historical research. Words like refugee and indigenous are banned, as if by denial they will cease to exist. Bangladesh has become living hell for the majority of its people. But I don't think that's a reason for giving up. While it is hell for those citizens, for ruling elite, it is paradise. They can loot, they can plunder at will. And while this wonderful nation, proud nation wilts, like George Floyd screams, "I can't breathe." But we will breathe. We will fight back. We will win back this land. There's a climate of fear. There's severe repression. But while they remain a few brave souls who continue to resist, they will instill courage. And we need you to stand by us. We want justice. Thank you.
Wow. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Alam, for that really wonderful, difficult, but ultimately inspiring presentation. And of course, the images, mostly your images, of course, that you showed, added such a powerful element to your words. So really very much appreciated to you for taking the time to speak with us. So if you're in the audience and you just watch and you want to pose a question, you should see a box at the bottom of your screen, Q&A or chat box. Just type in your question, hit send, and I'll see it. And so now we'll bring in Kaiser and Aftab, who may want to pose a question as well. But if I may use my prerogative as the moderator, I wanted to ask you the first question. And it's really an invitation to you to provide some broader historical context. You, of course, have covered Bangladesh under multiple political parties, the current AL, the BNP in the past, and of course, when there was military rule, you've seen a lot. So what I'm wondering if you could share with us is how do you think the current situation on the rights front, particularly the shrinking space for dissent, how does it compare relative to what you had seen in previous governments going back, the last few decades or so? Have you seen more stifling repressive conditions in the past, or do you think it's especially bad now? Is it unprecedentedly bad now? If you could just provide a bit of context, given the political history of Bangladesh here, that would be very, very useful to our audience.
I mean, as I mentioned earlier, we've never really had, a democratic system. I mean, by that, I mean, we have had 4 elections, which have been relatively free, but that hasn't actually led to democratic practice as such. And every government has gone progressively worse. I mean, extrajudicial killings began during the Mujib's period and have continued. Disappearances were relatively new, but the frequency has just gone up and up. And the situation today, I think, is worse than it's ever been by far. I mean, we have never really had a situation where all state institutions have been commandeered to such an extent, which is why there is so much of an issue, because there is now talk, for instance, of the EU sending in election observers. But under this regime, you cannot possibly have free and fair elections because the entire system has been corrupted. And party goons have been placed at every level of administration. But the level of fear is, I mean, when we talk to one another, we put away our mobile phones. I used to go around on a bicycle. I never do that anymore. I don't use a mobile phone anymore because it's not safe to do so. But it's never been as bad as this. And there are many of my friends, sadly, I hope they don't have to, but many of my friends who say, should there be another of those 2018-like elections, they have no choice but to leave the country.
And just a quick follow-up on that note, we all know that there is an election scheduled for next January. And of course, the ruling party has given assurances there'll be a free and fair election, even though most international observers would conclude the previous election was not at all free and fair. I know it's early days, but what do you think are the chances of a free and fair election come January?
Well, I mentioned earlier, 7 incumbent governments leading to incumbent wins, 4 caretaker leading to opposition wins. This is another incumbent government holding an election. So the statistics answered that in a sense. But I will go beyond that in a sense. I mean, the Prime Minister had opposed the caretaker government being led by Justice K.M. Hassan, who 20 years earlier had been at a relatively lower position in the BNP. Here, she, being the head of the Army League, wants to hold an election and expects the BNP to accept that as being reasonable. It's completely 2 different set of rules. It's one set of rules for her, one set of rules for the opposition. And she herself, when she was in opposition, actually said, I would support caretaker government for life. And now she wants to stay there for life.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for that. Kaiser or Aftab, would you like to pose a question before we go to our audience? Kaiser, I think you're muted.
It's coming now?
Yes.
It's okay? Yeah, okay. Thank you, Dr. Alam, for your wonderful presentation in Bangladesh about democracy in Bangladesh. It looks like the same story as other countries in South Asia are going through the same process, including Pakistan. So how would you describe a democracy in Bangladesh? Is it real democracy, hybrid arrangement, or a civil dictatorship, garb in democracy? What's your opinion on it?
Well, firstly, I must admit that I don't think a free and fair election in itself will give us democracy. I think that is part of the process. We really have to have systemic change. I mean, now the fact that all the institutions, state institutions, have been commandeered by the government means that the judiciary no longer performs impartially. The police is basically the armed thug of the government. The education system is a complete shambles. But we have to start somewhere. And I believe that having a fair and free election, apart from anything else, there are millions of young people who've become 18 after 2018 who've never voted in their lives. They should be given a chance to vote. But I think what needs to happen is really strengthening of those institutions. The good thing is that the Bangladeshi public is extremely politically savvy. The rickshawala in the street cannot read or write, but knows exactly what's going on. And in that sense, I would say that the average Bangladeshi is far more politically astute than the average person in the United States. So given that choice, I think we would, over time, be able to extract democracy out of this. But for that to happen, there has to be accountability. The people who govern are being governed have to have a say in the process of governance. And once that begins, I think we have begun walking on a journey that may eventually lead to democracy. It will certainly not happen overnight.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Alam, for your words and pictures, which really depict the true story of Bangladesh democracy. I have a couple of questions. What is the power structure of the ruling Awami League? Is there a succession plan there, considering that the Prime Minister is getting older and older? That is one thing. And the other thing is, what is the status of women's right in Bangladesh? Because I was reading some articles and reports, and last year 936 women were raped and 292 killed by their husbands or their families. So if you can elaborate on these two aspects, I'll be thankful.
Well, firstly, we essentially have a dynasty. I mean, it's ironic. I tell my European friends that they have the they have the kings and queens, and we have the monarchy. They come in. Of course, it's fair to mention that while one prime minister is a daughter and another is a widow of a former leader, they have actually hung on in very tenuous circumstances. And I have to give credit to their political acumen that they've been able to manage to do so. But democracy isn't practiced within either party. You've never had change of leadership any of the parties. The next layer of leadership has not been groomed. So at the end of the day, we wait upon the leader anointing someone from the dynasty to be the next person. And we don't know for sure who it's going to be. In BNP's case, it's a bit more clear-cut. In Army League's case, it's not quite so. But that's about the best that we can aspire to. It's who in the family steps in, which is as much as we have. In terms of your question about women's rights, it is ironic, the fact that we have had alternatively a woman prime minister since 1991, except for that period where it was the military caretaker government for 2 years. We really have not had women's rights. It's extremely patriarchal, extremely violent in occasions. There have been laws put in place quite serious laws, including death penalty and things like that, but it hasn't changed the culture. And to give you an example, after the 2018 election, a woman was gang raped because she had been perceived to have voted the wrong way.
Oh my God.
And this was people were allowed to get away with it. We know what's happening in Manipur, in India and elsewhere, but the protest picture I was showing you about was after a horrific rape in Noakhali, which took place. But there have been numerous ones, one after another, and really it's something that beggars belief.
Thank you.
Thank you. Those are some great questions, and thanks for those responses. So a number of questions from the audience. I may group some of them together, but the first one is sort of a follow-up to our earlier discussion about the election. There was a question from Senge Sereng. What do you think the chances are that the opposition will boycott the election? And then he also asks a question about, actually, I'll wait and bring that into another question. So the question is, do you think the opposition will boycott these elections, which of course has happened previously?
Well, the opposition says if there's not a level playing field, they will not participate in the elections. There is no scope of a level playing field ever happening under an incumbent government. Sheikh Hasina knows if there is a fair and free election, she'll be routed. So it's survival for her. She has no exit clause. I think she's going to hang on despite everything that everyone says. Sadly, I think BNP will boycott, though I don't think it should, because at the end of the day, you have to be competing. You can't win a game by giving a walkover. But I sympathize with them as well. I think they should have participated in 2014, but they didn't. But that's another issue. I think they should participate in this election. I don't think they will, which is unfortunate. At the end of the day, if things go according to plan, according to the master plan of the ruling party, the BNP will boycott. They will win whether or not they boycott, and she will return to power. And it is up to us and up to our friends and our allies to see whether we can engineer or force a different alternative. Because if we let things be, they will be here for life.
Well, thank you for that. So there are a series of questions related to domestic matters on the rights and democracy front in Bangladesh, and there are some questions about international responses. So let me focus on the former, get to a few questions about domestic aspects of the rights and democracy situation. So Mona Dave asked the question, how has corruption impacted the economy and current hardships faced by the public? And then we have a question from Safina Aman asking about your opinion on the education system in Bangladesh. She says it keeps on changing the history textbooks and creating generations whose focus appears to be on unsavory paths. So your views on education as well.
So I'll start with the first one. The first question was again,
what impact has corruption?
Corruption, yes, thank you. Well, I mean, Bangladesh has been right at the top of the corruption index for some time. It's not something we take pride in, but there we are. What has happened is that Bangladesh actually has prospered. It's prospered despite the politicians. The real heroes of Bangladesh are our garment workers, our migrant workers, our farmers in the field. They've continued to deliver, and the wealthy have continued to plunder. What is interesting is, despite the fact that the average Bangladeshi has his or her back against the wall because of increased prices, because of inflation and everything else, Bangladesh also has the fastest growing rate of ultra rich in the world. So there is this incredible gap, whereas the wealthy of our country are becoming wealthy at a phenomenal rate, the poor are getting poorer. On an average, this country is doing well, but it doesn't actually bode well for the majority of my country. One of the very interesting things that's happened is the United States actually recently issued sanctions against some people and stopped issuing visas against others. And that actually led to a sharp drop of extrajudicial killings. And it's also led to a change in tone in the streets, because so much money has been pumped out of Bangladesh into the United States and other countries, into real estate being invested everywhere. In 2019, in record terms, the Swiss bank had more money coming in from Bangladesh than ever before. So that's happening. And it's now, corruption has become so endemic that it's almost impossible to root out. In terms of the education, as I mentioned earlier, the fact that at every level, people are, merit no longer matters. It's whether you have party affiliation, it's whether you have party allegiance. That's the only criteria in public universities for tenure, for promotion, for perks. Students see this too, but students themselves know that if they're known to be party affiliated, then they will do well in exams and everything else. And that actually for me is my biggest concern. I recognize how badly the police and the judiciary and the bureaucracy have been corrupted, but with good governance, I think we can still recover from that. The fact that the education system had been demolished is something we will need generations to recover from.
Thanks for that. There's a question from Mahbub Leland with Benar News, Radio Free Asia, about the digital security law, which you mentioned before. He said, several times Bangladesh's law minister has promised that the Digital Security Act will be amended. What do you think about this?
Well, they had the ICT Act, which I was picked up under, and they had said that that would be amended and not replaced by a worse law, which is the Digital Security Act. Now, they've been talking for quite some time about the Digital Security Act being amended, but what they're trying to put in place is considerably worse. And so perhaps the Digital Security Act will be amended, but it won't be for the better, for sure. Certainly not if this government is in place.
Thank you for that. I'd now like to move into, there are a number of questions about international responses. So John Danilovich from Right to Freedom asks, what's the best way for foreign friends to help promote democracy, human rights, and free elections in Bangladesh? And we had another question that essentially asked you about the U.S. response. And of course, as you know, as you mentioned, the U.S. has actually taken a lot of interest in the rights and democracy situation with the RAB sanctions, as you mentioned, and also this visa policy that was announced some weeks ago. I think you mentioned that as well. So a question related to that is, why are we seeing this type of U.S. interest? Does it have anything to do with geopolitics and trying to gain leverage over China's growing influence in Bangladesh? And then what I'll add to that, to those questions about the international response, in particular the U.S. response, do you think that it's a good idea? Is it a good thing? Can it work for the U.S. to be applying pressure in the way that it has? Do you think that that could actually help move the needle forward toward better rights and democracy in Bangladesh?
I'm a Bangladeshi. I love my country. I don't like the idea of sanctions being made against my country, but it's a bit like having stage 4 cancer. Chemotherapy is poison, but you take it because it's the only way you can live. So at the moment, we have this ridiculous situation where we are, as George Floyd might have said, we're not able to breathe. So therefore, every respite is something that we welcome. On an average, about 25 people would die every month in extrajudicial killings. Since that sanction was put in, 25 people a month, though they've actually come up again, but about 25 people a month have lived who would otherwise have died. So that obviously is a good thing. But at the end of the day, do we really want to be at the whims of foreign powers? We don't. But what option do we have right now? You know, it's full spectral control. The opposition isn't able to extract anything at this stage, unless there is some way in which we can ensure that the will of the people is respected in some way, it will not happen. And certainly, we thought of neutral caretaker government. There could be a referendum, but even if there was a referendum, though that's been ruled out, even if there was a referendum, who would ensure a free and fair referendum? So we don't really have a choice. We're in this hellhole. So therefore, I think sadly we do need chemotherapy. I'm a cynic. I don't think international forces do things because of their moral interest. I think they do it because of their agenda. But if their agenda aligns with our agenda for the moment and gives us freedom, I'll accept it. And it is true that there is talk of the European Union, for instance, sending in observers. There's mixed opinion about that, because there are people who say that they would be rigged anyway, and you would really ratify that. You would, in a sense, rubber stamp an illegal election. The reason that is being said is people do not trust the international community. They know that they were robbed before, and the international community stood by. And I think trust has to be earned. And the international community has a lot of catching up to do to regain the trust of Bangladeshi people. And it will not be sufficient for them merely to do tut-tut and this is not what we accept, etc. They have to have concrete action, and they need to stand by it. They need to be walking the walk. And one thing I need to remind the international community, yes, they will have to work with governments, and this might be a pliant dictator that is convenient for them. But in doing so, they have alienated themselves from the Bangladeshi public. And the recent position that the United States has taken has, for once, actually turned Bangladeshi people towards the American government, which was never the case before. This is a rare moment in history where Bangladeshi people are actually pro-US. I don't think they should waste that opportunity. And that they should remember, at the end of the day, their friendship should be with the Bangladeshi people and not with the politicians.
Thank you for that. Really, really interesting. So there's a question from a fellow photojournalist, Richard Dowdy. He says, as the founder of one of the world's most progressive, South-focused, bear with me. As the founder of one of the world's most progressive, South-focused arts festivals, the biennial Chobi Mela Festival of Photography, can you say more about what effects the current situation is having on both photography and arts and journalism?
There is generally a situation of fear. There's self-censorship that applies to mainstream media, that applies to photographers, to artists. But I must say, I don't actually think our artists have done enough. There are far too many prominent artists who've stayed quiet when they should have been speaking. There are far too many photographers who should have been speaking when they've stayed silent. There are far too many media houses who've decided they'll play it safe. And we actually have missed one Chobi Mela for the first time. Hopefully, we will have the next one in January 2024. I no longer am director of Chobi Mela. One of my former colleagues, Tanzim Wahab, is, and they will have to answer that themselves. But I do believe Chobi Mela will come back. One of the things we did do was when the decision to hold the 10th Chobi Mela took place, I was in jail. It wasn't known whether I would come out, if I would come out, when I would come out. We decided to go ahead with the festival. I did come out. And on the opening event, we had a session on freedom of thought and expression in South Asia. And many, many people who have nothing to do with the arts have come over and said, we need to learn from this. How come? In such an extremely repressive space, when the government has full spectral control, Chobi Mela was able to resist in this manner. We did. Arundhati came over, they tried to stop her from speaking. We went ahead, we spoke. People sat on the floor and she spoke brilliantly for a couple of hours. We've continued to do these things, and I believe we have that tenacity. We can do it. It will not be easy. It was never promised it would be easy. But I think the arts is one of the routes. And one of the processes we've taken up is through 3 areas of intervention: media, education, and culture, to exert pressure upon the political space so politicians and the powerful elite cannot get away with their indiscretions.
So there's a related question to the one I just asked. It's from someone who chose to remain anonymous. A number of young activists are afraid of dissenting against the authorities. What kind of strategies should they take to minimize their risks and still make their voices heard?
Of course, one has to be strategic. I mean, martyrs don't make good reporters or good activists. So they have to stay alive and they have to stay out of jail. But I think we need to be pushing the envelope as well. And I think one of the reasons we are in this position is because too many people have stayed silent. And I think that collective force is something we need to recognize. And I believe we have not really recognized our power. People power is phenomenal. And I think already those cracks are beginning to show. The fact that the opposition is now holding these rallies despite all the resistance, despite the fact that the government is making it so difficult, trying to trip them up at every stage, is making a difference. I mean, we say the opposition will come into power, but in fact, today, if a banana tree stood against the Army League, it would win, merely because there's just so much discontent about the Army League. So we need to hang on in there. We need to be strategic. We need to be collectively doing things. But there are many ways to resist. And one of the things we've done, for instance, is we've begun a series called Chintar Khorak, which is called Food for Thought. And there we make provocative products, merchandise, tote bags, mugs, T-shirts. Each one resists in some way, makes a statement. And while someone might not be prepared to march in the streets, they might be happy to drink coffee from a mug, which protests. They might be okay carrying a Nur Hussain tote bag. They might be okay wearing a T-shirt that says no to rape. And I think we're creative people. We need to find creative solutions.
Thank you for that. One question I want to ask is if you could comment on the situation of the Rohingya. As you know, the Bangladesh government, oftentimes on the global stage, points to how it's hosted the millions of Rohingya refugees as a success story and a case of successfully accommodating this large number of people. But human rights activists have said differently. So just curious what your view is of how the government has handled the challenge of the Rohingya refugees.
The Rohingya situation is not new. The story broke in August 2017, but or was it August 2017? But the situation has been ongoing from the 70s, and the government has, over time, a very different approach to the Rohingyas. I think it's now recognized that this is a cash cow and that it can be turned in its favor. And for me, one of my criticisms of the foreign powers is the fact that it is the Rohingya equation that the government has been able to play, which has allowed it to get away with the human rights indiscretions, because it's kept brown bodies away from the doorsteps of Europe. But the Rohingyas need to be treated fairly. They're not even called refugees, because the minute you call them refugees, they're given rights. These are people who've been here for years, some of them. Some have had their entire youth in these camps. We need to ensure that they have a decent living. We need to ensure that they have education, that they have a dignity in life, that they have a future. The reality is they're not going to go back soon. Myanmar is what it is. And while it is there, it's a bit like my government making all these denials. Myanmar government saying, we'll be fine, come back, isn't going to appease people who've been raped and killed and terrorized in so many ways. So they don't have a choice unless they're rehabilitated elsewhere. This is their home. If this is their home, we have to treat them as such. 10 million refugees went from Bangladesh to India during the Liberation War. India was extremely generous, allowed us to be there, which is why we now have an independent country. We were able to go there, we were able to regroup, we were able to fight, and we fought back and we won back this country. Why should we not be able to respond in a similar way to others in peril? And that is what our Constitution says, that we will stand against all people who face repression. It is our constitutional duty to be protecting the Rohingyas.
Well, thank you for that. The hour's flown by. We're going to have to wrap up in just a moment. But I just wanted to ask you if you could briefly respond. There's a number of people that asked about this recent election, this development with the Election Commission in Bangladesh deciding not to grant registration to new political parties. If you had any take on that.
Well, we call this an election commission. The parties who've been recognized are parties that don't exist. No one's ever heard of them. They're fictional parties, effectively. The parties that have registered have all the validity that is necessary for a political party to be participating. I think it's sacrilege. I mean, what has happened is not only unfair, it's obscene. And to believe that an election commission that behaves in this manner will conduct a free and fair election, I mean, they've answered their own question. Why would the opposition or anyone else believe that an election commission that behaves in this manner is capable of holding a fair and free election?
Well, thank you for that. It's been wonderful to have you with us for the last hour. I've certainly learned a lot. I really appreciate the work you do, and certainly the presentation that you gave. And also, again, I linger on that moment of hope that you left off on in the prepared remarks. But really appreciated your responses to these questions. Thank you to those in the audience for your great questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all.
Michael, can I have a last question? Just a brief one.
Yeah, very brief. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Alam, for the wonderful presentation. It's been so long since Bangladesh is independent, and it's still Pakistan and Bangladesh are not in good relations. What do you think about it? Should they have it or continue like that? What's your view on it?
We have shared histories. I mean, all of us in the subcontinent, we are nearly 2 billion people. We're nearly 1/4 of the world's population. We have a shared history. We have huge diversity, but we also have huge commonalities, and we've grown up together. This diversity is our strength. I think not just Pakistan, I mean, all of our countries in this region should be working closely together. I think India and Pakistan should be friends. Yes. It is crazy that these two nuclear nations are at near war and have been at near war for so long. We should be far more mature than that. France and Germany, I mean, in Bangladesh, the French and the German embassies share the same building. Yet these are countries that have fought such a bitter war. We have, I mean, I abhor what Pakistan has done. It was ghastly, and it should be completely condemned. But I think the Pakistani people have a softness for Bangladeshi people. I think the Bangladeshi people would also like, as with Indians and Sri Lankans and everyone else, our governments have held us at ransom. I detest what Modi is doing, but I have nothing against the Indian public. And I think it is time that we, the public, need to take hold and not allow our politicians to keep us separated.
Thank you.
We will have national borders. I have no problems with that, but I think we should have no visas. I think we should have fair trade. I think we should have cultural interaction. And I think that we will all thrive as a result of that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Aftab, did you have any quick conclusion you want to make, or you're good?
No, I just wanted to share the optimism of Dr. Alam, because I have followed the history of of Bangladeshi people, right from the beginning of fighting for an independence, first against the Brits and then against the Pakistani colonialism. They have a way of saying, reaching a point when they say enough. And when that happens, they really take action towards the betterment of their society. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much again, Dr. Alam. This is wonderful. Thank you to South Asia Democracy Watch, to Kaiser and Aftab for your partnership. We look forward to reconvening next year for year 6 of this lecture. Again, thank you to all who tuned in. So with that, we will conclude and adjourn. So thank you all, and please be safe, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.